The summer sun scorched the fields of Virginia, but it could not burn the unease that lingered in the air. In the parlor of the sprawling plantation house, her father's eyes were colder than the iron bands that held the chains in the quarter, and his words cut deeper than any whip. She was unmarriageable, he declared, the syllables rolling across the room like a curse. The fire in the hearth flickered, as though shivering from the weight of the sentence, and the girl, no older than 16, felt her heart sink into a pit she could not climb out of. The moment was etched in the oppressive heat of a Virginia afternoon, where the air hung thick with the scent of tobacco and sweat, and the distant clatter of hoes against the soil was the only sound that punctuated the heavy silence of the plantation house. In the grand parlor, adorned with faded drapes and the stubborn glare of sunlight through dusty windows, her father sat rigid in his high, back chair, a figure carved from severity and cold authority. His hands rested on the polished mahogany table, veins taut, knuckles white, as if he were gripping the very will of the world. She stood before him, small and trembling in her plain cotton dress, aware that each word he would speak carried the weight of a verdict heavier than any lash. She had long known her place in his estimation, the whispered warnings of relatives and neighbors still ringing in her ears, but nothing had prepared her for the finality in his gaze. When he spoke, his voice was low but unyielding, an instrument of judgment sharpened over decades of pride and cruelty. He called her unmarriageable, a label that cut through her like a knife, sharp and unrelenting. It was not a word of despair alone, but a statement of ownership, a declaration that her fate was no longer hers to shape. She felt a chill creep along her spine, despite the summer heat, a premonition that her world, such as it was about to fracture entirely. Her father's decision was not tempered by compassion, hesitation, or even the faintest flicker of doubt. In his mind, he was settling accounts with a daughter whose spirit, he claimed, could not be contained within the fragile conventions of marriage, whose very existence, he declared, required containment by force. He summoned the strongest slave on the plantation, a man whose body seemed to carry the weight of both labor and silent rebellion, whose presence alone demanded attention. There was no discussion, no negotiation, only the inexorable inevitability of her being handed over, as if she were an object to be transferred, a burden to be placed where it might do least harm to the family's reputation. She could see the tension in the man's stance, the subtle resistance lurking behind his steady gaze, yet she also understood that defiance carried consequences darker than anything her imagination could conjure. Her father's decision was absolute, final, and irreversible, sealing her into a world where power, fear, and survival would become the only truths. She could trust. The man stood in the doorway, silent and towering, a figure carved from muscle and shadow. And for a long moment, he said nothing, letting the weight of the room press against him. He had spent his life on the plantation, obeying orders that bruised the body and gnawed at the spirit. Yet this command was different. It was not merely labor. It was the transfer of a life into his control, a burden not of his choosing. He felt the heat of the sun through the grimy windows, felt it against the sweat on his skin, but it did not reach the storm that raged quietly behind his eyes. Every fiber of him wanted to step back, to refuse, to declare that he would not become an instrument of the father's cruelty. Yet he knew the cost of defiance. On this plantation, a single act of disobedience could end in a whip, a broken bone, or worse. And he had seen it too often, witnessed men fall silent in the fields, their spirits crushed beneath the weight of unyielding authority. The girl stood in front of him, trembling, eyes wide, Yet there was a spark in her gaze that did not fully belong to fear. It was the hint of life unbowed. Even when faced with the shadow of a man she barely knew, he was tasked with containing her, with making her conform to a fate designed by cruelty and pride. And the injustice of it settled in his chest like a stone. He had spent years learning the rhythms of survival here, understanding the subtleties of power and the unspoken rules that governed the plantation. And he knew that outward compliance could hide inner resistance, but even that offered little solace. He bowed his head once, mechanically, acknowledging the father's decree, while his mind raced with possibilities and dangers. Every step he took toward fulfilling the command felt like a betrayal. Not only of the girl, but of the moral thread he clung to in a world designed to strip it away. He could feel the girl's presence like a pulse, soft yet persistent, and it reminded him of the life he had once dreamed of, before chains and orders defined him. As he moved beside her through the parlor and toward the quarters she would inhabit, he could sense the tension twisting between them, a fragile thread of fear, distrust, and perhaps an unspoken understanding. He was both jailer and protector, a role thrust upon him by the cruelty of another, and every moment of compliance felt like walking a knife's edge, balancing survival against conscience, obedience against rebellion. Days passed in the stifling rhythm of the plantation, each one stretching longer than the last, yet beneath the ordinary labor and routine. The girl began to notice things that did not belong. A loose floorboard here, a narrow gap behind the pantry shelves there, and whispers in the dark corners of the house that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. At first, she thought her imagination was betraying her, that the oppressive heat and the constant tension had begun to twist reality. But the signs were too persistent, too deliberate to ignore. She discovered scraps of paper tucked between beams, charred at the edges, but legible enough to reveal cryptic notes, fragments of forbidden thoughts and names long erased from memory. There were hints of old pacts, old alliances formed in desperation and secrecy, agreements between those who had been enslaved and the absent, hidden powers of the house itself. The walls seemed to remember things that the living refused to speak aloud, and at night, when the other occupants slept, she could hear faint murmurs from behind closed doors, footsteps that moved without purpose, and the soft rustling of what could only be secrets seeking attention. Her mind spun with the possibilities, wondering if the strongest slave, the man forced into the father's cruel command, had also noticed these signs, if he too carried knowledge he would not speak of. Slowly, an unspoken alliance began to form, tenuous and delicate, built not on trust but on the mutual recognition of survival in a place that sought to crush them both. The plantation was not merely land and labor. It was a living entity, a vessel of memory and silence, where every shadow held witness to acts of cruelty, defiance, and fleeting humanity. She began to follow these signs, moving quietly through the hidden passages, her pulse quickened with both fear and curiosity, sensing that the secrets she uncovered might hold the key to understanding the twisted power her father wielded so carelessly. And yet, for every discovery, there was a risk, a danger that even the slightest misstep could expose her to punishment far worse than the burden she already carried. Each note, each whisper, each shadowed glance became a thread in a larger tapestry of intrigue, weaving together the lives of those trapped within the plantation's walls, those whose loyalty had been bought with pain and fear, and those who still harbored resistance in silence. The girl realized that she was no longer merely an object of her father's cruelty. She had become a witness, a seeker of truths deliberately hidden. And with that knowledge came a new awareness of the power she might claim for herself. If she could navigate the dangers of a revelation and secrecy, night fell over the plantation like a shroud, thick and suffocating, blotting out the last traces of sunlight and leaving the world reduced to shadows and whispers. The cicadas droned their relentless chorus, but beneath their song, the house itself seemed to breathe with anticipation, as if aware that a reckoning was coming. The girl moved silently through the halls, her bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floors, heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon her, the lingering presence of generations who had suffered and resisted in silence, and she knew that tonight those ghosts might finally stir. The strongest slave walked beside her, his movements deliberate and controlled. Yet she could sense the tension coiled within him like a spring ready to snap. He had agreed to follow her through the hidden passages she had discovered, not out of obedience, but because he recognized the necessity of confronting the truths that had been buried beneath the plantation's polished exterior. As they reached the attic, a place rarely touched by the family, but heavy with the residue of forgotten lives, the air grew colder, carrying the scent of dust, decay, and secrets long ignored. There, hidden behind a rotting panel, they found evidence of her father's cruelty, laid bare ledgers of punishments, letters that betrayed sinister bargains, and artifacts that hinted at the manipulation of both the living and the memory of those who had died. The girl's pulse quickened as she realized that the house itself had conspired to conceal these truths, that the walls and floors had kept silent witnesses for decades, waiting for someone brave or desperate enough to uncover them. The slave's eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, the roles imposed by the father's authority seemed to dissolve, leaving only two humans confronting the darkness that had claimed so many before them. A sudden noise, a floorboard creaking underfoot, made them both freeze, shadows stretching long and monstrous across the walls, and the tension coiled tighter. Words were unnecessary. Each understood that this night could change everything. The girl, trembling yet resolute, touched the ledger, feeling the weight of the knowledge it carried, the exposure of truths that had been meant to remain buried. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the shutters like distant echoes of past screams, and the plantation seemed to lean in, listening, waiting, aware that the delicate balance of fear, power, and survival was about to tip. In that attic, under the watchful gaze of ghosts and secrets, confrontation became inevitable. The girl, the man who had been forced into compliance, and the legacy of cruelty and manipulation converged in a single, shivering moment where the consequences of revelation and defiance hung heavier than the night itself. The plantation had grown quieter in the days that followed, but the silence was deceptive, heavy with the tension of secrets poised to erupt. The girl had learned to move like a shadow, tracing the corridors and hidden passages with the practiced caution of someone who knew every floorboard and every creak, understanding that knowledge alone could be both weapon and protection. The strongest slave had changed as well, his stoic exterior now tinged with a tension born of both fear and determination. Together, they navigated the fragile web of the house's hidden truths, each revelation chipping away at the authority her father had wielded so unchallenged for years. They discovered letters and ledgers that not only chronicled acts of cruelty, but hinted at alliances and betrayals long forgotten. And in those fragile scraps of paper, the imbalance of power began to shift. The girl realized that the plantation, which had once seemed an immovable monolith of oppression, was built upon the fragile obedience and fear of those it enslaved. Every command her father had issued, every cruel whim he had enforced, relied on the silence of others, and once that silence began to fracture, The house itself seemed less certain of its dominance. One night, as wind rattled the shutters and shadows danced like restless spirits across the walls, the girl and the slave confronted the final pieces of the puzzle. A hidden ledger detailing her father's dealings with men both feared and reviled, his manipulation of lives both free and bound, and the vulnerability he had cultivated through arrogance and pride. She felt a surge of both dread and exhilaration, knowing that exposure of these truths could undo the world as it had been. Yet the cost of misstep could be catastrophic. The slave's hand brushed hers, a quiet acknowledgement of shared understanding, a pact forged not from authority but from necessity and courage. And as the night deepened, the power her father once held so unquestioned began to unravel. The walls of the house seemed to lean in, as though the structure itself understood the delicate balance tipping, aware that control, once absolute, was now tenuous. Each movement, each whispered strategy, each hidden step toward revelation heightened the tension, until the plantation no longer seemed like a place of simple hierarchy, but a labyrinth of human will, fear, and the possibility of rebellion. The girl recognized that what had begun as her father's assertion of dominance could now become a catalyst for transformation, that within the shadows and hidden spaces of the house lay the power to disrupt, to challenge, and perhaps even to escape the suffocating legacy of cruelty that had defined her existence. And the seeds of that change, once planted, could not easily be uprooted.